Sometimes verbal reasoning can feel like a race against the clock. You've got 30 seconds to speed read an entire passage, try to answer as many questions as possible in only 22 minutes, and still while getting all of them right. If you're in this position, I completely understand. I sat the UCAT last summer and it was tough trying to do the verbal reasoning section. It's such a time constrained section, having to read such large passages and still get the questions correct to get a high score. But don't worry, in this video, I'm going to be carrying on from part 1 on all the different tips and strategies to help you get that high score. In this video, we're going to continue going over the different question types that are in verbal reasoning, and we're going to go over timing tips and how to improve speed reading, so by the end of it, you can ace this section. Hi, I'm Loveleen. I sat the UCAT last summer, got a score of 2,950 Band 2 and a score of 710 in the verbal reasoning section. The only way I was able to get such a good score from the VR section is because I used good technique and learned how to speed read, and that's exactly what I'm going to be telling you in this video. If you haven't seen part 1, make sure you check it out, as in there we go over some of the question types such as true, false, can't tell, type 1 and type 2 statements. We go over some timing tips, what VR is, and also the keyword approach, which is essential when approaching every single VR question. I also have a completely free UCAT document which has tips and strategies on every single section in the UCAT, so make sure you email me to get access to that too. Let's start off by looking at the 4th question type that you can get in the VR section. This is something called reverse questions. These are very similar to type 2 questions, they are just essentially the opposite. As they're reverse questions, they're often in a negative form. So the question stem, as shown in the example on screen, will often have something like the word cannot, do not, essentially a negative form. So this means that extreme language is more likely to be true. This is because in the question, it's essentially asking you which of these options is not true. And out of those 4 options, extreme language is less likely to be true. Extreme language, as we spoke about in the previous video, is often words like most, always, and never, because they are very extreme ways of putting things in comparison to milder language like occasionally and sometimes. Because extreme language is less likely to be true, when you read through your 4 answer options, you want to look at the extreme language option first, and that is the one you want to look at in the text. So again, you use the keyword approach, you'll skim read the text, and if you find evidence in the text that goes against the extreme language option, that is your answer and you move on. Again, you're not going to waste time going back and checking the other answer options. As soon as you have found one that fits, you select that and move on to the next question. The final question type that you can get in the VR section is something called writer questions. Now, these are arguably the most difficult and most time-consuming questions. What writer questions are basically asking you for is what the author's opinion is from the text, and what does the author think is the most important issue. And these are roughly along the lines the question type that you'll get when looking at writer questions. Now, the approach to these questions is slightly different. So when you see a writer question, of course you'll always read the question first, and based off of that, if the question is asking you something about the author's opinion about the writer and what they think is the most important issue, for example, in their text, then what you're going to do is read roughly the first 2 sentences and the last 2 sentences of the entire passage. This gives you just a really good idea of what the passage is about. The other reason that we do this is because typically the author will include their most important views in these areas of the text, either at the beginning or at the end, because they want to re-emphasize that point. So by reading that bit, you can roughly work out what is important to this author, what are they focusing on. Then you go back to the answer options, and based off of those roughly 2 to 4 sentences that you've read, you're going to look at your answer options and try to work out, okay, organize them into thinking what is most important to the author, and then you're just going to use the keyword approach for them and work through them systematically. And hopefully the first 1 or 2 that you pick, you can look for the keyword, and then you'll be able to work out what the answer is. Again, it's important to remember that as these questions are more time consuming because you're having to read extra and it's a little bit harder to organise those 4 statements, of course it will get better with practice, but even still it is a time consuming method. For these questions, it may be better, especially if you are going over your 30 seconds, to guess from the options that you have left, flag the question and move on, because you do not want to be going over your 30 seconds and eating into the time of the rest of your questions, especially when those questions are a lot easier to answer and you can do a lot better compared to just wasting all your time on one specific writer question. Up until now, we've really been focusing on technique to help you improve answering these questions, but what will really accelerate you and make you improve so much more is by pairing these techniques with improving your speed reading. So now we're going to go over some ways that you can improve your speed reading and become faster. So then if you're able to read really quickly and use these techniques, you'll definitely be able to improve your score. So The idea of speed reading is that you're able to read the text really quickly and you only have to read it once, so you're able to retain that information. Now, there are a couple of ways that you can practice this, and these are all ways that I helped myself to practice too, so that I became quicker. The first thing I'd really recommend you using is the skills trainers on Medify, MedEntry, or any other platform. These skills trainers are designed to help you become quicker at speed reading. So for example, every morning you could spend 5-10 minutes as part of your UCAT warm-up prep to just do these skills trainers, and then over time you'll see that you become quicker and quicker at reading. The second way that you can improve your speed reading is that just pick up an article you've never seen before, pick up a book, anything, try to read, for example, a page of it as quick as you can, and then put it away, write down all the information from it that you remember, and then go back and just look, what did you pick up from that text, what didn't you, and try to work those out. Another tip for speed reading is doing something called indenting. So when you're actually in the UCAT exam or doing UCAT mock papers and you're trying to speed read, what you do is that you don't read the last word and the first word on both sides of the passage. So essentially you're skipping those words. And as you're indenting them, it means you're just shortening the amount of reading you have to do and just allow your peripheral vision to fill in those. That is definitely a difficult skill that comes with practice, but the more you do it, the easier it will become. Another tip, which again, it's very difficult to start off with, but the more you do it, the better you become, is having something called a soft gaze. This means that you're just very quickly and lightly looking at the text and kind of reading only half of the letters. I definitely found this really, really difficult, but the more you do it, the more natural it becomes, and it will insanely increase the speed you're reading at. So by reading only half of the letters basically, rather than trying to look at everything, so having that softer gaze towards the text just means that you can read more of it more quickly, and again, allowing your peripheral vision to fill in the rest. Now, in the situation where you are struggling for timing, there are a few things that you can do. The first tip I have is knowing when to flag a question and move on. It's really important that you're not spending too long on just one question. So if you're finding a question really difficult or a passage really difficult to understand, just guess it, flag, and move on. If you are wasting time on that, it's just going to drag you down and your overall score down. If you're just struggling on one question, by moving on from it, when you come back later, you might be able to do it more easily just because you've had that break from the question and you're still able to answer the rest of your questions. So I really recommend, do not underestimate the importance of flagging the question, guessing it, and just moving on. The second thing I'd like to mention is that, again, in your actual exam, if you are in the situation where you don't have enough time to answer questions, here are a few timing tips on what you should do in those situations. So in the situation where, for example, you have around 5 minutes and 10 to 15 questions to answer, in this situation, what you should be trying to do is something called a rabbit pace. What a rabbit pace means is that you're going to be doing quality guesses. So this means you have enough time to take a guess, but you have time to think through that guess. Now, the way to do effective guessing in the verbal reasoning section is, as we've discussed before, number one is to look for extreme language. This is the most important thing. So with extreme language, apart from reverse questions, extreme language is always less likely to be true. For reverse questions, it's more likely to be true. So read the question, identify what the question type is, and then use extreme language to help you deduce an answer from that. The second strategy is if you have, for example, around 20 questions to answer and only a couple minutes left, essentially you have loads of questions and not enough time. In this case, this is when you would try to rapidly guess as much as possible. You may not be able to take quality guesses as much compared to the previous option. So this is why overall it's really important to keep a track of timing. The final tip that I have, this applies not just to verbal reasoning, but to all the sections, is to make sure you learn keyboard shortcuts. These probably only save around like a second or two per question, but that is very valuable time in the UCAT exam. So I remember when I was sitting the UCAT, I learned a few of them, such as how to bring up the calculator for decision making and QR, and then how to go to the next question and the previous questions. These are really helpful because it just means you're not wasting time moving the mouse, clicking to the next question. Your mouse can stay near the question options, and then you just use the keyboard shortcuts to move on to the next question much more quickly. You're able to stay in that rhythm and you feel more in control. So that's why I really recommend learning these keyboard shortcuts to reduce your time. I hope that understanding the different question types, how to approach them, and learning these different techniques has definitely helped you to feel more confident when approaching verbal reasoning questions. Make sure to reach out to me and email me for free access to my UCAT document, as that has tips and strategies for all the different UCAT sections. And also don't forget to check out my videos where I have tips on the other UCAT sections too, like decision making, quantitative reasoning, and SJT.